Josh Peck. Today it seems it's becoming easier for the world to believe in a type of creative force to explain our very existence. The only problem is it isn't the true creative force they're finding it easier to believe in. More and more in our culture and even throughout the world, the belief in extraterrestrials creating and shaping humanity is replacing the belief in the one and only creator God of the Bible. What makes this false belief so dangerous is how widespread it is being accepted with no real proof. It would seem the world is more inclined to blindly believe a lie than to accept the reality of truth that binds together all of creation. This is why it's so important for the church to be aware of the deceptions at hand and to have an answer prepared when confronted. We need to learn to discern truth from the lie. We need to learn to hear others out when they wish to share some of that truth with us. We need to learn to be sharpened. That has been the goal of this show since day one, and tonight a guest joins us who I believe not only contributes, but epitomizes that same goal with his vast body of work and ministry. S. Douglas Woodward is an author, speaker, and researcher on the topics of 2012, the apocalypse, and biblical eschatology, with over 40 years' experience in researching, writing, and teaching on the subject. Some of his books include Decoding Doomsday, Power Quest Book 1, America's Obsession with the Paranormal, Power Quest Book 2, The Ascendancy of Antichrist in America, The Final Babylon, America and the Coming of Antichrist, a book he co-authored with Douglas W. Krieger and Dene McGriff, and most recently, Lying Wonders of the Red Planet, Exposing the Lie of Ancient Aliens, which will be the topic of tonight's show. Doug, it's a pleasure to have you on the show, and it's definitely an honor.
Oh, well, thanks, Josh. We have become friends, of course, as we typically play Words with Friends late at night. And recently I've been able to, to really take the game to you. So it's been increasingly fun.
Yeah.
But I'm looking forward to this conversation. We've had a chance to read one another's works and get to know one another. So this should be a very good time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you brought that up because I was gonna mention that if you hadn't that many of our listeners might not know that we are bitter rivals in the
That's
age-old game of Words with
Words
Friends.
with Friends. Yes, exactly.
And you're actually the one that got my wife and I addicted to that game in the first place. But
Uh,
luckily for us, you do graciously allow us to win a couple
uh,
games here and there.
No, I decided after you guys beat me several times that I would have to concentrate more because you're both very capable. So it keeps me awake at night. I can't go off to sleep playing now because I'm so attentive to our games. So,
Same here.
so
Yeah, and well, the cool thing about Words with Friends too is that there's a chat window included in the game, and this is part of what keeps me up at night too, is because we can actually have conversations. It
yes,
allows you to talk with the person you're playing against. And I remember in one of our conversations, we got on the topic of the show Ancient Aliens on the History Channel.
yes,
We talked about how you and I we both have seen every episode, but of course we don't
right,
watch it for entertainment or as an accurate source of information,
right.
but to learn about the deceptions that are going on in our culture. Because, Doug, while you and I don't believe in the worldview that they promulgate, there are countless others out there that actually do. And I think at its heart, it's that false worldview issue that you really tackle in your book. Doug, for those who may not be familiar with your work, could you give us your testimony, how you got started, how you came to know Jesus, and how that brought you to writing your new book, Lying Wonders of the Red Planet?
Sure. It might be sort of a circuitous route to where I got to the writing the books, but when I was 15 years old, I should start off by saying, as a child, probably 10, 11, 12 years old, I used to watch Billy Graham, and so somewhere along the line, I prayed with Billy on television and became a Christian. The Lord really got my attention when I was 15. I had a very nasty form of cancer called rhabdomyosarcoma,
Ooh.
which at that time killed about 9 out of 10 adolescents that had that type of cancer. So this was back in 1969. And but happily, fortunately, I made it through with no reoccurrence. And so it was counted, I think, pretty much as a miracle by most my physicians and certainly all the people around the country that were praying for me. So that got my attention. I studied the scripture quite a lot during that time and became very convinced that that the Lord had a plan for my life, as I used to say in my Campus Crusade for Christ days at the University of Oklahoma, when I would go out and witness on campus to people. And but I intended to go into the ministry full time, and did so for a while. I was in the United Methodist Church and the Presbyterian Church. Despite being in those bastions of liberalism, I still managed to maintain an orthodox point of view, and count myself an evangelical Christian, and probably dispensational more than any other school of thought. And but through the years, I've read and studied and taught, and then about 5 or 6 years ago, I felt called to start writing. And I'd always wanted to write, but I'd always been probably too busy. I was an executive with Microsoft, with Oracle, partner at Ernst & Young, so I'd always been sort of in corporate America, which is very consuming. But it came time for me to write. So for the last 5 years, I've been involved in writing about 7 books now, with this latest one on the issue of ancient aliens and how the planet Mars sort of figures into this whole storyline. So anyway, so that's kind of how I've gotten to the point where I am, and happily this week I also am pleased to announce that I'm a grandfather for the first time.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, so we're very happy about that. And of course, you've had a new little one as well.
Yep,
recently.
just about a couple months ago. Yep.
Yeah, little Nathan.
Yeah.
And so that's fantastic. Well, mine's little Brody Woodward.
Oh.
So we're very pleased, and so anyway, so that's a little bit of my biographical background.
Oh, praise God for that. Yeah, I was going to ask you about your new grandbaby.
Yes.
Got the email. Yeah, that's...
Just like the bumper sticker. Ask me about my grandbaby.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, I got to hold him last night for the first time, and
oh wow,
he's quite a baby. I'm convinced he's the best baby right now. I'm sure Nathan's close second, but Brody's number one.
Oh no, I hear what you're saying. Your grandbaby's better than my baby. I get it.
That's right. I get all the fun. You get all the responsibility.
Yeah. Yeah, no kidding. I know my place.
That's right. So.
Oh, that's great.
Oh.
So where did in your book you talk a lot about the false teachings of the ancient alien doctrine and panspermia and all that. So where did the whole idea of ancient aliens, panspermia, and all that get started? And what does that have to do with Mars in our culture today?
Right. Well, of course, that's, we'll talk about the answer to that question over the next 90, 100 minutes or whatever, because that's the core issue. Certainly, the ancient alien phenomenon that we see on the History Channel and H2, and they're doing a new series now, and I forgot what it's called, In Search of Ancient Aliens or something, but it began. We've seen that, of course, over the last 4 or 5 years on the History Channel, but it really began back in the 19th century. Probably traces its roots to 2 characters. One would be Madame Blavatsky, Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, who I've talked about in a number of my books. She was the founder of the Theosophical movement, and her teaching, which came out in the book on ISIS that she wrote, and then The Secret Doctrine, which ended up being dramatically influential in the Nazi movement in Germany. But her spirituality included the belief that the ancient civilization Atlantis was initially influenced by extraterrestrials that had come to Earth millions of years ago, of course, and her dating and her timing, can't be taken literally, which of course for me is one of the reasons why it can't be true. But nevertheless, her view was the secret doctrine. At the top of the secret doctrine was this notion of a race that was influenced by extraterrestrials. And so it really began with Blavatsky in the 1880s, 1890s. And another individual that really influenced ancient aliens significantly was a congressman from Minnesota, Ignatius Donnelly. He had written a book on Atlantis. And that's one of the themes that you see carried out throughout the ancient alien theory, is the sort of merger of ancient civilizations and extraterrestrials. And the question, one of the core questions is were ancient civilizations made to be intelligent about astronomy and about the the thing we call a precession, which is what the Mayan calendar was built upon, and a lot of that was discussed, how the Earth wobbles, but in its wobbling it takes approximately 25,920 years for it to complete one spin, if you will, on its axis. And but this concept of precession was known in ancient civilizations and was able to be measured and built into these calendars that are thousands of years old. And so the question is, how did these ancient civilizations, how were they so wise and knowledgeable about astronomy?
Yeah.
And so there's sort of two answers. One answer is that they were taught this by extraterrestrials, and so they became wise that way. The other possible answer is that through psychic traveling, soul travel, astral projection, that these shamans, such as the Mayan shamans, traveled throughout the universe and contacted aliens and saw things in the galaxy and beyond that taught them the essence of the universe. And so there's sort of two, both equally paranormal concepts, which is the extraterrestrial theory, and but the tie-in of these two things: ancient civilizations more advanced than we knew, or we know, at least in regular history, and the concept of extraterrestrials. That's really the genesis of this whole ancient alien phenomenon.
Wow. Yeah, it's fascinating how things like that can come about in our modern culture, and something that you've talked about too, and something that we talked about on this show quite a bit is the coming great deception and strong delusion and those sorts of things.
Right.
In your opinion, what is the final deception, and what's Mars' role in it, and
Right.
how does that have to do with like the ancient aliens and all these ancient cultures?
Right. Well, there's certainly no shortage of deception, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's deception from many different world religions. I believe that in our day, that any religion that is going to have the capacity to convince the whole world is going to have a very heavy dose of science thrown in. That science is, in some ways, has become the religion of all of the intellectuals. Most scientists, not all, but most, are atheists or naturalists or materialists, and so for the whole world to be led into a great deception, it really seems to me that science has got to be part of the story. And so, I don't think that the sources, the spiritual sources, that the channeling, which is very common amongst virtually almost all of the pseudo-religions that have been built up around extraterrestrials, I don't think channeling by itself is going to be the major sort of catalyst. I think it's going to be some type of scientific discovery. So I'm really looking for some sort of artifact to be discovered on Mars or the Moon. And of course, in the last 50 years, that's really what we've tended to hear about, would be those individuals that believe that there was more to what NASA was doing on the Moon than we were led to believe. The movie Dark of the Moon, Transformers, Dark of the Moon, certainly talks about that. But it's the notion that there have been aliens that have been, extraterrestrials that have been in our solar system, may have even been on our Earth, but the only place where they have left evidence that is sort of incontrovertible would be on the Moon or Mars, one of the planets or one of the heavenly bodies that we can access physically, not just psychically, which many have, and we could talk about that. But we need to be able to access those locations physically. We need to be able to find artifacts. So the notion of artifacts really is an artificial. It's literally a fact of art. It's an item that's been created by an intelligence. And if we were to find an artifact on the Moon or on Mars, it would absolutely forever change the conception that mankind has about itself. That there are possibly other races, other intelligences out there, and it might put us in our place, so to speak. Now, for Christians, we believe that it is certainly conceivable that God has created other beings on other planets, and we certainly believe in angels and demons and spiritual beings.
Hmm.
But the issue for us is, our whole cosmology is built around the idea that our planet is decisive for the universe.
Right.
That Jesus Christ came here once. He didn't go to every planet. He came to our planet and he died. And certainly the trilogy that C.S. Lewis did, that we know about, Out of the Silent Planet and That Hideous Strength and so on. His trilogy talks about life on other planets, but it does so in the context of the Earth still being the sort of cosmologically decisive planet. There's a war going on between Lucifer and Yahweh, and what happens, mankind is very much in the middle of this, and so our cosmology is built on that. So the idea that we might discover a face on Mars, an underground base on Mars, or that we might discover, as Richard Hoagland and Mike Barra talk about, that before we were Earthlings, we were actually Martians. This would dramatically change what we think about ourselves. A physicist named John Brandenburg says as much in his book Life and Death on Mars, that the meaning of humanity basically will be, that Mars, he says at this point in time, Mars is just about ready to give up its secret. And when it does, the meaning of humankind will finally be disclosed. So there's this anticipation that something dramatic is going to be discovered on the moon or on Mars, and that with it, it's going to forever change the notion that we have about the place of humankind.
Wow. So for those who might not know your stance, do you believe that there are beings on other planets? Do you believe that it's possible that we may have come from another planet, or what's your whole through your Christian? Because a lot of Christians have a lot of different variations of the same worldview.
Right.
So what's yours?
I'm pretty old-fashioned.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that God literally created Adam from some red clay,
Mm-hmm.
and he breathed into him a living soul and spirit. And so I even believe he did this about 6,000 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I happen to be, this is where your friend Doug Hamp and I disagree. Doug is a creationist. I'm more of an intelligent design guy. I happen to believe in the so-called gap theory, which is that the universe is potentially as old as science says that it is. It's potentially billions of years old, and yet I believe that humankind, Homo sapiens sapiens, is a special direct creation of God, just like the angels, that we are sons of God, and that Adam and Eve were placed in the garden somewhere between the Tigris and the Euphrates in the Garden of Eden. So I'm very I very much believe that. Now, part of the story is it possible that other beings exist on other planets? I think it is possible, but again, I think, like C.S. Lewis pointed out in his trilogy, that they are at least loosely aware of what's going on planet Earth.
Right.
And so if they do exist, they know about what's going on here. So, again, we're cosmically decisive, I think, is the phrase I would use. What happens here has implications for the whole universe. And I believe in angels and demons, and I believe that aliens are really demons in disguise. And so I stand pretty much in the same place as does L.A. Marzulli, who wrote the foreword to my book, Tom Horn, Gary Stearman, a host of others, that we believe that the extraterrestrial masquerades as a gray alien or as a reptilian or as a Nordic, but the reality is that they're demonic beings, that they know how to materialize. There could also be hybrid beings. We could talk about that. But I'm pretty much a traditionalist.
Yeah, I think I fall in line with almost all of that. I'm still on the fence about the gap theory thing, but that's just me.
As I said, someone asked me about that. I don't think it was you that I responded to, but I said, I'm committed to the biblical truth, the biblical inspiration, the infallibility of Scripture. That's my lifelong commitment. The gap theory is my current understanding.
And I think that's great, too, because something I talk a lot about on the show is that even if we don't necessarily agree perfectly with another interpretation, if that interpretation can be backed up with Scripture, and first and foremost Scripture, we should at least allow for the possibility and, maybe
Right.
file it away for later in case it, has implications later. So
Well,
that's
absolutely. And you and I both know, topics like the rapture are ones that, the firm believers might believe that the scripture backs up only their view, but
hmm
the reality is that there are many positions, and scripture can be made to support
hmm
many positions. And what I say is the reality will become clearer and clearer as we progress through time. And
yes.
when it will become very obvious at one point or another whether we are all of a sudden caught up in the clouds to be with the Lord forever,
Yep.
or whether we're seeing Mr. Antichrist introduce himself on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem,
hmm
and we'll know then kind of more what's going to happen in the days ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's why it's so important to prepare now for things like that, just in
Mhm.
case, because you
Right.
never know. And plus, I mean, it's good study anyway. There's things in there we can apply to our day-to-day lives as well. So
Absolutely.
with this whole exploration into Mars and looking for these artifacts and everything, there's a deception behind some of that. Do you believe like when we look at, like, say, NASA, do you believe that
Right.
NASA is just strictly for scientific study, or do you think that they are actually trying to promulgate a deception, or maybe they're doing it unknowingly, or what's your take on that?
There's several factors. One, I'd say that there is a deception that
hmm
NASA is guilty of. I'd say part of it is understandable. It's rationalization. Part of it is very sinister.
hmm
What's understandable is that NASA, all scientists have been reluctant to espouse the concept of intelligent life in other worlds because they know it conflicts with a traditional view of religion,
hmm
and so they are reluctant to comment on whether or not intelligent life exists elsewhere. So you have that factor. You also have the factor that scientists, particularly those at NASA, JPL, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory out in Pasadena, they get funding from the U.S. government,
hmm
and the U.S. government is built on the principle of the separation of church and state. And so, when you begin to talk about extraterrestrials, you begin to cross the line between state and church, and you begin to make comments that have influence upon what people believe.
hmm
And so, people are very reluctant to do that. Scientists are careful because they know that getting funding from the Congress is they need to keep it in the realm of science.
hmm
They don't want to move over into the realm of religion. And so you see, and I talk about this in my book in several places, you'll see a Carl Sagan in the 1960s write a book with a Russian scientist, and he points out that the one of the moons of Mars, Phobos, there's two moons, Phobos and Deimos, Fear and Terror is what they're named, which were the sons' names of Mars in
Oh wow.
mythology, right? And but he talks about the fact that Phobos appears to be hollow,
hmm.
and he'll say he basically makes the statement in this book, co-authored back in the 1960s, and he makes the statement that natural heavenly bodies cannot be hollow.
hmm
And so what he's saying is that we have to consider the possibility that the Martian satellites are artificial.
Oh wow.
And so he said that in the 1960s. Now, by the time he wrote Cosmos in 1980, which was one of the most popular books written during that time frame, and it accompanied a PBS broadcast, Cosmos, that he narrated in that same time frame, and it was the most popular PBS public broadcast show during the 1980s. So there's a great hunger, amongst the populace to understand what's out there in the stars. And but when he wrote Cosmos, he was much more careful about what he said, particularly on the planet Mars.
hmm
And he referred a lot to the writers of Martian stories like Edgar Rice Burroughs, Ray Bradbury, people that have written great fictional stories about Mars. But he was not eager to talk at all about the possibility of intelligent life. One of the pyramids on Mars, known as the Elysium Pyramid, is extremely symmetrical, a four-sided pyramid.
Hmm.
Yeah, it looks, like I said, it does not look like it could be a natural phenomenon with four sort of perfectly symmetrical sides. You can see it's covered over by some type of soil or particles. Mars doesn't really have soil. It sort of has particles.
Mm-hmm.
Soil comes from life, from creatures dying and decaying and so forth. And Mars appears to have some type of particulate matter that covers its surface, little granules, but not necessarily soil. We talk about Martian soil just for convenience, but it really isn't soil. So anyway, though, Sagan basically said, well, I look at this Elysium pyramid and I say, surely it's a natural formation, but it probably demands a careful look.
Wow.
And so, so there's this undercurrent of thinking, even amongst responsible scientists, that there could be evidence, not so much of life on Mars today, because Mars, the atmosphere today, it has 1% the atmosphere that the Earth has. It doesn't have a breathable atmosphere, and so it does not appear that Mars has life on it today. But it certainly seems possible that life forms of some sort may have existed on Mars in the distant past. Now, how distant, whether it's 10,000 years ago or 3 million years ago, we can talk about more specifically, as I do talk about in the latter part of my book.
Wow.
So anyway, so now that's sort of the natural kind of career sensitive aspect to what's been going on with Mars, why scientists might be hesitant. Now the other part, though, of your question was, is there a deception that NASA has been promulgating about Mars? Do they know more than they're telling? And of course, I take that subject up in great detail in several of the chapters. But the answer to that appears to be yes.
Wow.
It appears that NASA does know more. Back in 1960, there was this report called the Brookings Institute, which still exists today. They're consultants, they're a think tank. And they did a report back in 1960, and it's just known now as kind of the Brookings Report. But in that report, it was not speculated, it was stated, unashamedly, it was stated that we will, when we go kicking over rocks on the moon and on Mars, we will find artifacts of ancient civilizations. And we should prepare ourselves for it. And that was a headline in the New York Times when this report was released to Congress. And it was stated very cautionary that we have to brace ourselves religiously, philosophically, scientifically for the fact that we might be confronted with a superior race. And that based upon what we've seen on Earth, that once confronted with a superior race, an existing society could crumble from just the stresses associated with knowing that there's someone out there that's smarter than me that could pose a threat.
Wow. Do you see that happening, or how would you let's say that happens and they find something that's definitely artificial, that's millions of years old. How do we, as Christians and really as a society, how do we guard against that? Like how do we reconcile that with our beliefs? Right.
Well, that of course is as they used to say back in the old days, the $64,000 question. That used to be a quiz show. You're too young to know that. That used to be, and it was kind of like pyramid. You'd work your way up to that question, and so I think the answer is this is where the late David Flynn, I think, really did us a great service. He provided some terrific research in a book that he did called the Secret Chronicles of Cydonia. Cydonia is this particular place on Mars that's been the focus of a lot of study, research, speculation, hysteria, whatnot, by a number of what are called the Pyramidiates now. Those people that believe that there is a connection between the pyramids, so-called on Mars, and the pyramids of Egypt. And that is a key theme that we'll come back to and talk more about. But that issue of finding artifacts, David Flynn tackles it by looking at some pretty obscure passages in the Bible that talk about a entity or a planet or a people that he refers to as Rahab. And traditional historians would say, well, Rahab was Egypt. But there's some reasons to believe that it wasn't. We also have some references to the fact that there was this guy named Lucifer that he was the anointed cherub, and he walked amidst the stones of fire.
Mm-hmm.
What are the stones of fire? Well, it's likely that the stones of fire are the planets,
Mm-hmm.
and that they burn brightly in the sky, especially Mars, which is very red even to the naked eye. You can pretty much tell Mars when it's close by Earth because it's very bright, becomes brighter, almost as bright as Venus, but it's very red.
Mm-hmm.
And so humankind's always been fascinated by the red planet. And so anyway, the idea that Flynn worked on was the possibility that there was a civilization on Mars, or more specifically, on a planet that was associated with Mars. Mars was its moon,
Oh,
and
wow.
that planet was destroyed and became the asteroid belt. And what he does is he does a very in-depth study of classic mythology, looking at both Egyptian as well as Greek and Roman mythologies. And he talks about the notion of Cydonia. I don't recall the name exactly, but supposedly it is curious that the apple that was in the Garden of Eden was actually a golden fruit, and it's a two-word Latin name, but the first word is Sidonius.
Oh, wow.
And so there is a mythology in humankind that talks about Cydonia as sort of the place of beginnings. And the Cydonia was named on Mars was named by Giovanni Schiaparelli, who was the first person to use the term canal or canali.
Mm-hmm.
In 1877. He was during that opposition. He had studied Mars very carefully, and he began to talk about the canals of Mars. And some say, well, he just meant rivers. Well, he really didn't. He really meant canals. For the next 30 or 40 years, it became a common view that Mars did hold a human race, that it was a human race, and that there was indeed intelligence on Mars, and we were somehow related to it. And this view persisted, that this was an existing race and so forth. We'll talk more about that, but get back to Flynn. So Flynn came up with the idea that on Rahab, it was a civilization where the angels resided.
Mm-hmm.
And that at some point in time, because of their rebellion, Lucifer was the leading cherub. They may have even created a face on Mars. That Mars faced Rahab. We know that Mars was a moon because it's not symmetrical in terms of its gravity. Its gravity is weighted towards one side, just like our moon is. Well, our moon has a face that faces us all the time. It has a dark side that we never see, which really isn't dark. It's just sometimes it's dark, sometimes it's not dark. On a new moon, it's completely bright. We're just not there to see it because we're on the other side.
Right.
But both our moon and Mars faced the planet to which they orbited, around which they orbited, 100% of the time. And so Mars has the characteristics of a moon. And so the theory that Flynn had was that the planet was destroyed in some manner, probably a natural cause. But once it was destroyed, it smacked Mars, and that's why Mars has some very unusual physical characteristics that we can talk about. But it created the asteroid belt. And of course, part of the discussion about, well, how did Mars blow up? What happened? I talk about that in the book. You haven't gotten to it yet because you haven't gotten into the depths of the latter chapters, but I get into some of the physics and some of the concepts of Tom Van Flandern, the late astronomer that was responsible for the Naval Observatory, and did quite a bit of work in this whole issue of the asteroid belt, and was there an exploded planet? Was there one or two exploded planets? And why do we have the asteroid belt and all that? Well, so Flynn's idea is that angels at some time came to Earth.
Mm-hmm.
They came to Earth. They may have, in fact, then corrupted the Earth. It's also possible that they did this after they would have done this after the cataclysm, but perhaps they didn't come to the Earth until after the water. Rahab was apparently a planet full of water, and it flooded Mars. Mars over time lost all of its water because it did not have a sufficient amount of gravity to hold its water. So Mars can't hold its water. But Mars before that may have had a number of monuments that were set up on Mars, just like the monuments on Earth, the pyramids and so forth, may have been set up. They may have been established by a common sort of ancestry. And so Flynn suggests, just like Hoagland does, but from a Christian perspective, that there could be a linkage between Rahab, the missing or exploded planet, and the Earth, and that the fact that there are these pyramidal structures on Mars, potentially the face on Mars is the face of a cherub, but we can talk about that too. But in fact, Wendy Alec, who's written a number of fictional novels, she is a Christian, and she's written a number of novels, but in one of her latest novels, she talks about and uses as part of the plot line the idea that the face on Mars was in fact the face of Lucifer.
Oh, wow.
And that half of it is leonine, and half of it is simian, which means half of it looks like a lion and half of it looks like a human.
Huh.
And there's some suggestions of that based upon the analysis that's been done the last 10 years, that could be a possibility. Of course, it's also possible that it might be purely a natural phenomenon, but there's a lot of evidence that suggests that it may not be a natural phenomenon. We can't prove it, in my opinion, one way or the other. But anyway, so Flynn develops a mythology, and then he goes into all the mystery religions, and points out how there is embedded in these mystery religions that were originated on Crete and Samothrace. They eventually filtered into the Egyptian mythology, the Grecian and the Roman mythology. But there's this part of this mythology is that humanity, or at least civilization, came to Earth from another planet, and specifically from Mars. And so Flynn talks about that extensively. And so anyway, so the question then is, well, if you're a Christian and we discover these artifacts on Mars, assuming for a moment that, for the sake of argument, that they exist, what should we think? Does that mean we need to desert the Bible, that we need to assume that it's all false and that we've been misled? Not necessarily would be my answer. In fact, Flynn provides a way that we can reconcile the possibility, in fact, I would argue the probability, that we will discover artifacts on the moon and on Mars, and how we can reconcile that with the biblical cosmology. So long answer is that, yeah, there's a way to reconcile it. David Flynn kind of points the way.
Wow, that's great. And I've always found his work absolutely fascinating. I even cite some of it in my new book. It's not going to be out for a while, so I probably shouldn't talk too much about that. But yeah,
always tease it. You can always tease the new book. So.
Absolutely. I tend to throw it in there every episode or two.
Well, but, you can't not, because you're excited about what you're writing about.
Very true.
Yeah, that's good. That's good.
So that's in the case of artifacts. So there is an answer, and that's fantastic. There's at least some way that Christians can reconcile it. Something else that you talk a lot about in your book is the connection between UFO sightings and personal perception, or as you call it, the role of the mind. And I think that kind of plays into reconciling these things into our beliefs too. Can you explain the role of the mind in UFO manifestations?
Yeah, again, it's kind of a theory. More, it's nothing I can prove, but there are just some, like most theories, you look for empirical data to kind of substantiate the theory that suggests that you probably have a theory that explains the facts that you can find. And what I talk about in that is that I believe that the human mind is involved in the shaping of reality. That that there, I believe. Jung, C.G. Jung, was virtually an occultist, but I still believe that the notion of the collective unconscious, the idea that there's sort of a world mind that our minds sort of participate in, I believe that's probably true. That's why we have these things called archetypes, which he talked about. And certainly one of the archetypes that I'm dealing with in the book is this archetype that we're connected in some way with Mars. And exactly how, we don't know, but that is one of the underlying ideas, and it seems to be an archetype of the human mind, and it seems to be a consistent storyline. And we'll talk more about how it's connected to some of the CIA investigations of the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, which I go at length into. But anyway, there's this connection. In one of the key figures in rocket science is a guy named Jack Parsons. Mm-hmm. Jack Parsons was the head of the JPL, Jet Propulsion Laboratory, sometimes called the Jack Parsons Laboratory, by the people that worked there because he was so influential. He was not the only scientist there. In fact, Theodor von Karman was the German scientist who was very instrumental in its success. But anyway, Jack Parsons, the initial goal of JPL was to develop rocket fuel. They called it Jet Propulsion Laboratory because if you said rocket smacked of fiction and a Flash Gordon. Mm-hmm. And so it was not, didn't sound scientific enough. Mm-hmm. So there you go. Once again, scientists are very concerned about not sounding like they're talking about science fiction, and yet science and science fiction lots of times have a very thin line that separates them. Mm-hmm. So anyway, Jack Parsons, though, also in his spare time, happened to be the priest for an institution called the Ordo Templi Orientis, OTO for short, which was a creation of the great black magician Aleister Crowley in England, who, of course, is a very colorful figure. And in his notions, I go into in depth towards the end of the book and talk about the relationship between his sort of occult theology, if you will. It's really more like an occult demonology, and the paranormal, and Mars, and space, and so forth, and extraterrestrials in particular. So I'm trying not to get too lost in my thoughts here, but
no, go for it. I'm on the edge of my seat listening to you. You but, go ahead and get lost.
Okay. Well. Anyway, so Jack Parsons was kind of where we were going. He in the early 1940s went out into the desert, and of course we all know the story about Roswell in 1947. But earlier, before that time, he had gone out into the desert, the Mojave Desert, out in Southern California. And he and an associate conjured, they attempted to do they in fact did do a magical incantation or working called the Babylon working formula, which was, my understanding is that it was connected with Crowley. And Crowley did a number of these occult rituals. In fact, he did many of them. That was part of the religion, were these rituals. But it's theorized by Nick Redfern and others that when Parsons did this Babylon working, where he was trying to conjure the whore of Babylon, that he opened a portal of some kind, and that in opening this portal, he let in some type of demonic force from, you might say, the second heaven. Oh, wow. And that all of a sudden you begin to see a much more frequent occurrence of UFOs. Because it wasn't long after that we began to see the Kenneth Arnold episode near Seattle, which is where I lived about 21 years. Another incident that occurred in Utah, that this FBI agent named Guy Bannister. Do you remember that name?
Sounds familiar.
Guy Bannister was the FBI agent responsible for the office in New Orleans where Lee Harvey Oswald was passing out pamphlets pro-Castro.
Oh, wow.
In downtown New Orleans. It's portrayed in the Oliver Stone movie Kennedy, or JFK, and what's his name? Ed Asner plays Guy Bannister. Well, Guy Bannister also pops up in the story of UFOs.
Wow.
In fact, a week after Kenneth Arnold first saw his 9 UFOs, 9 is also a significant number, the whole discussion of the paranormal and outer space. But a week after Kenneth Arnold discovered his UFOs, and by the way, Kenneth Arnold was a friend of Jack Parsons.
Oh, wow.
Guy Bannister talks about seeing UFOs in Utah. 2 weeks after that, Roswell occurs.
Huh.
And so you've got all these very, very weird coincidences. Why was a FBI agent making sure that he was being vocal about a UFO incident that he supposedly saw in Utah.
Mm-hmm.
And then later on, about 15 years later, he's involved potentially in the conspiracy to kill Kennedy.
Mm-hmm.
So there seems to be a CIA connection there as well. So, or at least Edgar Hoover may himself have been involved in all of that, which that's another theory that's plausible. So anyway, so the theory though is that Parsons did something and opened the possibility of UFOs, and then he actually had a group of science fiction writers that were associated with him out in Southern California, and they used to meet at his house. So you had guys like Robert Heinlein, 2 or 3 others, and then you had another guy named L. Ron Hubbard.
Mm-hmm.
These guys all met with Parsons, and after they started meeting and they started writing science fiction where UFOs were talked about greatly, all of a sudden UFOs began to appear around the globe much more frequently. So you have these special rituals that were happening. You have science fiction being written. You had the Lovecraft's science fiction that had been written in the 20s and 30s, but was being published and being celebrated more in the 40s and 50s. So you have many more people aware of flying saucers, of this whole notion of the paranormal, and then you start seeing UFOs begin to manifest more frequently. So the question is, to what extent does the mind itself create the possibility for the UFO? There's a whole series of stories I talk about in the PowerQuest books, as well as to some extent in this book, about the involvement of the CIA and other intelligence service groups that were investigating the connection between the paranormal and outer space and UFOs. And in fact, there was this one group that was formed in 1952, not long after. Well, actually, what I should say is in 1952, there was a significant appearance of UFOs over the Capitol in Washington. It was known as the Washington Flap. Mm-hmm. And it happened over 2 successive weekends in July.
Wow.
1952. The Air Force scrambled jets. The jets could not keep up with the UFOs. The UFOs were shown on radar at the time. They were witnessed by pilots at the airports there in Washington, D.C., and so you had literally thousands of people witnessing them. But we talk about Roswell. We don't often talk about the Washington Flap. The Washington Flap was probably a more significant one in terms of it causing very specific, trusted parties like the U.S. Air Force to go after them, after these UFOs. And it was right at that point that we began to see movies come out. It came from outer space. Flying saucers over Washington. All of these movies began to happen. The first 3D movie was the summer after the Washington Flap, about an alien whose spacecraft crashed on Earth, and it was freaking everybody out. So there's there's this big connection between what was happening in science fiction and what was beginning to happen in the so-called real world. And then, of course, since that time, there have been more and more theories advanced about how the human mind influences what happens. Mm-hmm. In fact, even there's a recent book done by, Lynn Picknett and Clive Prince on, it's called The Forbidden Universe. And I don't necessarily agree with their worldview, but they do a lot of good research. And this book talks a bit about the recent research that's been done where human beings actually can influence the future.
Oh, wow.
Rather than being, in other words, they're causative. It's not just an effect. Mm-hmm. And so that really reverses things. But it does sort of suggest what Christians believe, that there is a continuum, that time, that infinity sort of surrounds time, and that God is able to experience and see all of time in one instance, even though we experience time just, sort of like on the edge of a knife, just one event at a time. And but there's this idea that the mind does influence what happens. And there are examples now where you'll see on YouTube where individuals that are known to be able to manifest UFOs, they are there on camera and they are asked to bring about a glowing orb or whatever, and within a few minutes they do. Mm-hmm. And so there's this notion that we play a role somehow in the creation or the materialization of entities, of extraterrestrials. Always been true in the study of ghosts. channeling and so forth, that that you get a collection of people together around a Ouija board or around a crystal ball, and you hold hands, and you do whatever the medium says, and sometimes many of these things are, of course, tricks, parlor tricks as they're known, but sometimes manifestations occur. And so exactly what happens, we don't really know, but it's certainly been true that the study of Mars and the study of the paranormal have tended to go hand in hand.
Absolutely. So do you think this the whole role of the mind idea, do you think it might have anything to do with any like other odd things that are sometimes seen or noticed, such as, well, every now and then there will be a news story about some oddity that's been photographed on the surface of Mars. I think most recently it's been the jelly donut
The jelly donuts.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
That seemed to just kind of appear out of nowhere. And do you think
right.
the role of the mind might sometimes convince people that there are more extraordinary explanations to things like that, or even other things photographed, such as the face on Mars?
Yeah, I think there's probably, I think the jelly donut and these kinds of like sort of physical things that are on the Martian surface. I don't think that that's the mind so much. I think that's probably physical, just a physical reality and physical causes. I think that the possibility exists that gray aliens and some of the other aliens that we see, that the mind may have some role to play in that.
Their interpretations of the
Yes,
yeah.
there definitely are. I think was it Joe Jordan? He would interpret alien abductions as strictly a visionary mind experience, that there really aren't physically gray aliens, that people don't physically leave their room, so forth. I think there's a lot of evidence that says that Joe's wrong. that there can be physical manifestations, whether it's ectoplasm like Slimer and the Ghostbusters, the green slime,
Yeah.
or whether it's the implants that L.A. and Roger Lear, the doctor that does the alien implant, or extracting alien implants. There's some reasons to believe that there are physical manifestations. There certainly have been alien abductions where supposedly a person was not in the room and people went searching for them, and a few hours later they show back up in their room. They have no recollection of what's happened until they're taken under hypnosis, and then they tell these amazing stories of how they were levitated from their bed through the walls onto the spaceship. And then also L.A. I don't think I'm spoiling what's on Watcher 7, but it's okay. Watcher 7's out now, so people can see it.
Yeah.
But they do radiation readings, and in a couple's bed where, let's say, the man is taken or the woman is taken and the other one's not, there's actually radiation readings that suggest that there was some contact, some physical experience that the husband, let's say, had and the woman didn't. Only the husband's side of the bed has any kind of a Gauss reading, whereas the other side doesn't. So there's various physical traces, and again, you can probably get skeptics to go out and try to find explanations for why that's not true. But I would just say it is certainly possible that the human mind has some role to play in bringing about in the physical plane a spirit, and that's always been sort of the view of those that study the paranormal thing, is that they believe that the mind plays a role in that respect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so even in New Age practices has gotten big into that, and you mentioned earlier about astral projection, and you talk about remote viewing and things like that in your book, and even things like that have found their way into space exploration and trying to answer some of the more difficult questions about other life in the universe. So how did this get started with these practices? What's the government's role in it, and how exactly what exactly are these people seeing with using things like astral projection, remote viewing, in space exploration?
Well, we might take one. Let's take one thing at a time.
Yeah.
First, I love all these subjects. They're great. Remember those.
Yeah.
Probably one of all those questions.
Yeah, I kind of threw a lot at you at once there.
I just did a cough drop, so hopefully my tickle in my throat will go away here in a moment. The Aleister Crowley and his religion, which is based upon sexual magic, extensive black magical rituals that were originally performed by John Dee, who was the astrologer for Queen Elizabeth I back in the 16th century. A lot of this really deep, dark magic, the power of the dark side, if you will, Crowley really cultivated and sort of brought into a structure which he called the Thelema, Thelema. It's like Thelema, but I think it's pronounced Thelema religion. And that it follows from the same discussion we were just having about the role of mind. The importance of his religion was to conjure spirits. He conjured a spirit named Lamb, who had a physical manifestation, who looked a lot like a gray alien. Didn't have the big eyes. He had more of the Richard Nixon slitty little eyes, but he otherwise was a short gray being, which is, by the way, I think they're also called little green men. The guy that actually coined the phrase little green men was a remote viewer for the military, by the way.
Oh, wow.
He was a sports writer, and he was also a remote viewer for the military.
Huh.
But that's another story. So Crowley, though, it was part of the Thelemite religion that to be a member, you needed to be able to use ritual to conjure a spirit to where it was physically manifested. And so that was how the initiate into that religion had to be able to call a spirit into physical presence. And so we know that was very much, that was really a key to the religion. Also, we know that the emphasis in Crowleyism was using sexual magic and using the concept of sex as a way to call into presence demonic spirits as well. It's likely that they came to see them as otherworldly entities or demons. Not demons, but extraterrestrials. And so that the real goal and the future kind of the leader of the OTO today is a guy named Kenneth Grant. I think he's a late Kenneth Grant, but I need to verify that. It's talked about in Peter Levenda's most recent book, The Dark Lord. But Grant specifically says that the OTO, what Jack Parsons was the high priest for in Pasadena, that its specific goal is to conjure these entities and to have encounters with otherworldly entities. That's what their religion is about. So for them, worship is a calling forth of these entities, and they're encountering, manipulating them, and trying to gain mastery over them. So it sounds a lot like witchcraft, and it is. And it is. And so Crowley, turns out that Crowley was certainly a key figure in the kind of the connection with the other world, with trying to bring about the encounter. And the real goal was sexual contact with these entities. So you kind of see that in the movie Ghostbusters a little bit, where Sigourney Weaver's character, is wanting to have sex with Bill Murray's character. And so it kind of has this sort of connection back to Crowleyism or the Thelemite religion. And we also have heard, of course, the terms incubi and succubi. But this was the idea of in fact, having sex or copulating with a spirit. And so all this stuff is all kind of wrapped together. But in present day, the notion of encountering the extraterrestrial, even having sex with the extraterrestrial, well, hey, Katy Perry had a song called E.T.
Yeah.
That's exactly what it's about. I'm ready to have your baby, and then we see at the end that she walks off and she's some type of a hybrid, centaur or whatever. So the notion has been around for centuries, and it is, in fact, the sort of the underbelly of this whole notion of extraterrestrials is the idea that we have contact with them. And certainly the issue of hybrids, the abduction, all the phenomenon associated with alien abduction. So much of it is the gathering of ovum, of sperm cells, and attempting to create hybrids. And the work that David Jacobs has done, a professor, I believe it's from Temple University in Philadelphia, where he's a professor. But he's done extensive work with hundreds of victims of alien abduction, and that's certainly the same story that you hear there. So anyway, that's kind of in a capsule, the completion of the whole issue of Jack Parsons. This religion that's based upon contact with extraterrestrials, ongoing contact, present day contact. That is not what you hear a lot about on Ancient Aliens on the History Channel.
Right.
But it is absolutely a key part of the whole story of Ancient Aliens. Is this notion of interaction with extraterrestrials. Now, you also ask about remote viewing, and you also ask about the government involvement and all that. So let's go on and pick one of those things, or follow up on a question on that, because these are all big topics.
Yeah.
They're all covered in the book, by the way, for the listener.
Yep.
Even in a much more organized way than probably you and I are talking about them, so that's okay.
Oh, that's fine. Conversations don't have to be organized.
Not too much. Although I usually try to answer the question. That organization, I think, is a good thing. So,
yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, we've heard of like the government trying to use remote viewing for different things, and does that play a role in the government's attempt at space exploration, or is it purely just religious practice, or how does that tie together?
Yeah, remote viewing is a capability that's been developed by the U.S. government primarily for intelligence work. The military in Maryland created a small group of remote viewers in the 1970s. A guy named Joe McMonigal was the first remote viewer, but the lessons really came from a guy named Ingo Swann. And Swann did extensive work with the government through contractors at Stanford Research Institute in the 1970s. Ingo Swann really is considered the father of remote viewing. The remote viewer is able to see, not necessarily soul travel, but consciously travel to a location, typically somewhere on this world, and is able to detect or gain information and report back. They're sort of in a semi-conscious, semi-unconscious state when they do this. And the sessions typically last for only 15 to 20 minutes, the way it's been developed in the military. I've had, by the way, people from the military at speaking sessions I've done where I've talked about this that have come up and verified that not only do they know about the unit, but they've actually used the unit to do research. So it definitely existed and probably still exists today, although the government denies it.
Right.
But I have a personal experience that tells me that it still exists today, which I didn't talk about in this book. I talked about in the PowerQuest book. So the remote viewers, though, almost all of them talk about experiences that they've had on the moon or on Mars. In those experiences, they consistently talk about the fact that on Mars, there is, under the face of Mars, there is a expansive cavern that is very mechanical, very technological, and that supposedly there are beings that are in a state of suspended animation in this cavern. Now, do I believe it? Not necessarily. But this whole issue of military bases on Mars, of deep underground military bases, Martians living beneath the surface, well, along the same lines as remote viewing, we can actually go back to 1958. In 1958, there was a cartoonist who he was a comic book artist named Jack Kirby. And he wrote a comic book and illustrated it. I actually have a picture of it in the book called The Face on Mars. This was in 1958. The face on Mars was not photographed until 1976. But there were several instances well before even 1958 where the notion of the concept of a face on Mars existed. Even in a 1953 television program that also was a Viewmaster 3D. Did you ever do a Viewmaster? You're pretty young, so you probably didn't. You did a Viewmaster? Okay.
Oh, yeah.
It was called Tom Corbett Space Cadet.
Oh, wow.
And it talks about the story, kind of pretty much like 2001, the idea that there was an artifact on the moon, and this artifact on the moon led them to more artifacts on the planet Mars. And of course, Arthur C. Clarke's story, The Great Monolith, is discovered on the moon, and it is sending out a beacon to a moon. I think it's Iapetus on Jupiter. and or Io, I forget which moon, but anyway, it's the same idea. 2001, if I'm correct, was done about 1963, 1964, something like that. Arthur C. Clarke, and then let's see, who was the great, very famous film director producer that did the Clockwork, Stanley Kubrick. 2001 was a Stanley Kubrick movie.
Yep.
So, and in it, in fact, Arthur C. Clarke actually stated that the reason he did the film was as a direct response to the Brookings report we talked about earlier, that that humankind might not be able to handle the truth. You see the fellow that goes up to the moon, that is on his way to the moon, at the beginning of the film. He comes out and he briefs people saying, we have to condition humanity to accept the fact that there is now proof of intelligent life on the moon, and it clearly is an artifact, and so forth. So Clarke was onto this. But anyway, the notion of the face on Mars, the story of that comic book and Jack Kirby was that these explorers went to Mars and they sort of stumbled upon this face. And when they went into the face, they went down through the eyes and they came into this underground cavern that had all these highly advanced technological machines. And they were able to see a recording of apparently this race that was that moved or migrated to Mars from another planet because they were under attack from other aliens. And so they saw Mars as a refuge. They went to Mars and they built a very conspicuous face. I don't know why, if you're trying to hide. But nevertheless, they were under the surface of this face. And so these American astronauts discover this whole story, this whole cosmology of extraterrestrials coming to Mars, migrating to Mars, and then apparently they become extinct somehow. And so they've just left these marvels, these technological marvels, there for humankind to discover. So this was in 1958.
Wow.
And so Jack Kirby is related to the movie Argo, because what happened, if you may recall the story of Argo, which was Best Picture 2012, it was the Ben Affleck film, talked about the rescue of the 6 Americans from the Canadian embassy in Tehran. Part of the story was, and where Argo came from, was they made up Argo as the name of a story that they could then build a film crew as their ruse to go to Tehran and to rescue these individuals. You may recall, if you saw the film, or if your listeners did, that they look a lot like Star Wars characters and are the Argo characters. Argo, of course, comes from Jason and the Argonauts. Argo was the name of the ship of Jason's Argonauts, and it was looking for the Golden Fleece. Well, the story is that there really was a book. It was called Lord of Light, and it was going to be made into a film. At least it had a screenplay written, but it never had gotten backing. But the Lord of Light was the true name of the film that they made up the name Argo for. All right, so what's the connection? Well, the artist that the CIA really used in 1979, was a guy named Jack Kirby. So he had actually done the artwork. He did the artwork that the CIA used in their ruse, their actual trip to Tehran. They used his artwork as a means to talk about the Lord of Light film. That was their cover for going in to make the rescue happen. Wow. So what there is the connection, and this is Nick Redford's research, by the way, to give him credit. In his book Pyramids and the Pentagon, he talks about the connection and the interest of the Pentagon in exploring the pyramids and the possibility that there was this ancient technology that was once on Earth, and where did it come from? And we want to know about it before the Russians do, so that we can exploit it for a weapon of war. Well, anyway, the CIA may have been using remote viewing. We know it began to be studied as early as 1947, 1948 by a guy named Andrija Puharich, who was doing work for the Navy and eventually for the Army. This was before Operation Paperclip, which was kicked off in the early 1950s by the CIA. But we know that there were studies being done, and Andrija Puharich who happens to be, by the way, the uncle of a friend of mine. Uncle Hank to him, but this is a real character. This is one of the mysterious characters in the American story of the paranormal and UFOs, and it happens I have a 1 degree of separation from him, so it's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
But Puharich is quite a character, and he links into this whole ancient alien story as well because of his studies in the sort of the 9 principles, the Egyptian Aeneid, the idea that there were these channeled 9 gods that are supposedly planning to appear on Earth. It turns out that the Maya also had these 9 gods, and so there's a connection there as well. But anyway, to finish the story, so Kirby has this connection with the CIA. The CIA seems to know about the face on Mars. A guy named James Hurtak supposedly saw the face on Mars and published about it in 1973. And it was actually Viking 1 in July of 1976 that photographed the famous picture of the face on Mars. And so there appears that there was remote viewing that was being done.
Wow.
So the question for us is, well, how much of that's reliable?
Mm-hmm.
Much of that is real? How much of that is deception?
Mm-hmm.
And fast forwarding, we may or may not have time to talk about it in this show. We may have to come back and do it again, is to talk about the whole issue of jump rooms, high-speed travel between the Earth and Mars, the concept of deep underground military bases on Mars, and specific individuals that have been trained by the remote viewers, supposedly Ed Dames, who was the colonel leading, or Major Ed Dames leading the remote viewer contingent in the 1980s, 1990s. Supposedly Ed Dames was involved in training a group of individuals, one of which was no less than Barry Soetoro, which your listeners might remember as the name chosen by a guy named Barack Obama.
Mm-hmm.
So it really gets into an incredible mythos that I talk about in the book, and it's the story of Andrew Basiago and his supposed travel back and forth to Mars, and the story that there is a vast underground colony on Mars already of 500,000 people living on Mars. And there's a lot of stories, a guy named Michael Relfi, and so on. So it's another whole story that I talk about, and it's another whole mythos that's been sort of promulgated in our day about the issue of Martians and the connection between Martians and humans. In short, Basiago believes that there was a point in time where Homo sapiens were on Mars. There was a split. Some of them stayed on Mars, some of them came to Earth, and that he's actually met the Martians. They are humanoid. They look very much like us, but there's enough difference that it was clear from his standpoint that we were pursuing different evolutionary paths over the last, thousands and thousands of years, perhaps 20,000 years. And so the question, of course, is, well, could we still have babies together? And that gets into the interesting subject of the Nephilim, doesn't it?
Yeah, definitely.
Yes, so, but anyway, so there's, as you can see, we're only scratching the surface. We haven't even talked about the real Star Wars, the cosmic war of Joseph P. Farrell, and so on. And so, but I'll let you get back to your questions.
Oh yeah, I'm just I'm blown away by the information that's contained in your book and in this interview, and yeah, I'm at a loss for words. How much time do you have for this interview, or would you like to do a part 2 at some point?
Sure.
Or,
sure. I think we could definitely do that. We might finish up. What I might do is suggest we've got, I don't know, maybe another 10 minutes or so right now. We might talk a bit about some of the characters, Percival Lowell and Camille Flammarion. They're really interesting people that influenced heavily the notion of Mars and why Mars is really such a part of the context of the story of ancient aliens. And because we haven't really probably sufficiently talked about that. But yeah,
let's get into it.
Yeah, we could come back and talk about some of the, kind of bring the story forward and talk about kind of what's happening now, and ultimately why I believe that Mars is likely to play a significant role in this thing we call the coming Great Deception. Mm-hmm. Just for the sake of the listeners, let me read the verse specifically about lying wonders and just mention that. there's a verse in Second Thessalonians, I believe it's 2, verse 9, and the verse is, even him whose coming is after the working of Satan with all power and signs and lying wonders. All right, and so the idea, in fact, the phrase lying wonders, the book is called Lying Wonders of the Red Planet, Exposing the Lie of Ancient Aliens, for those that may have just joined us. And you can hit rewind and listen to the whole thing, right? But lying wonders is a phrase that's used 16 times in the New Testament.
Wow.
It's generally used about the Antichrist. It's used a little bit about Jesus Christ. But it's either used about Antichrist or Jesus Christ. And it's used 16 times. And so, and as the Strong's Concordance would tell us, lying wonders and signs tends to be associated with signs in the heavens.
Wow.
And so there seems to be a connection with the great deception and the heavens. And so it is my conviction that, kind of back to the first point I made about science, that the great deception likely will be associated with the phenomenon of extraterrestrials, UFOs, artifacts discovered on the moon or on Mars, and the science that sort of says, see there, we really were extraterrestrially influenced, just like Zecharia Sitchin said, or just like the Ancient Alien show says. And so, so that's the reality of the human race. And so this whole notion of Christian cosmology, the biblical worldview, it's all entirely false. And we have the proof to disprove Christian faith, the Christian faith. So I think that's the great deception. And I think L.A. Marzulli would agree with me. And of course, we're just going to likely to see more and more evidence of that as we go. So let me talk, maybe in the last part of this, we could talk about the connection of Mars with ancient aliens and where this all got going.
Absolutely.
So we talked earlier about Madame Blavatsky and her concepts, but Percival Lowell and a Frenchman named Camille Flammarion were really two very instrumental people in the popularization of the concept of Mars and intelligent life. Percival Lowell, and probably the key point is that they both were very connected to the paranormal, meaning that, and you see this almost all the time with Mars, when someone is interested in Mars, they're almost always also interested in the paranormal. Not entirely. We have a lot of scientists that are, in fact, I even have a nephew that's a project manager on the Curiosity project that landed, I have a nephew, let's see, I have a niece whose husband works for JPL, and he's a project manager.
Wow.
On the Curiosity project. So I actually have another sort of 1 degree of separation from Mars as well.
Huh.
Anyway, Percival Lowell was on a trip to Japan in 1894. And he was there to study Shinto mesmerism, basically, which was like hypnosis or trances. So he was studying the supernatural in Japan. He was a well-to-do person. He was from a very wealthy family. I used to drive through Lowell, Massachusetts, on my way to work when I lived in New Hampshire and worked in Boston in the computer industry. I worked with Microsoft and Honeywell and Oracle while I was in Boston. But anyway, Lowell, Massachusetts, that's his family. They had the great mills, that part of the Industrial Revolution. They were very much a part of that. But anyway, Lowell was fascinated by Mars. At that time, Schiaparelli had been talking about and actually had made a map of Mars. And as David Flynn points out, the zero meridian on Mars runs right through the face of Cydonia.
Oh, wow.
How did Schiaparelli know that?
Yeah.
He was a Jesuit, just like a lot of the other Jesuits. There was an earlier Jesuit named Pietro Secchi, who had even taught in the U.S. during the 1850s. And both of them ran the Roman Observatory that today, is it Michael Funes and Gabriel Funes, the Jesuit astronomers that Chris Putnam and Tom Horn talks about in Exo Vaticana. These are all Jesuits. The Jesuits have been talking about the plurality of worlds of extraterrestrial life for almost 2 centuries.
Wow.
How do the Jesuits know? Well, David Flynn says they were schooled in the mystery religions. That's why they talk about the plurality of worlds. So, anyway, so Percival Lowell was fascinated by Mars. He heard that Giovanni Schiaparelli was failing in his eyesight. So he built an observatory in Flagstaff, And the same year that he finished his study in Japan, he began to do observation in the mountains at the, it's called Mars Hill, by the way, in and the Palomar Observatory, by the way. Palomar actually means the phalanx of Mars.
Oh, geez. Wow.
So you have that in Pasadena. So, you know, the connections with Mars and so forth, it's legion, basically. The connections are legion. Well, anyway, so Lowell begins to study Mars. He begins to be a very popular writer. He was a great writer, a romanticist, and he believed that there was intelligent life on Mars. And so he created additional maps of the canals, and he popularized the notion of the Martians. Camille Flammarion had done even more, probably, for the concept of Mars than even Percival Lowell. He lived, he was a contemporary. In fact, the two had met, and they also had met with Schiaparelli when Lowell went to Europe to meet them all in the 1890s. And but anyway, Flammarion was probably the most famous Frenchman from the time of Napoleon and perhaps until the time of Charles de Gaulle. So Flammarion was well known around the world. He was an astronomer. He also did cartography or map making on Mars. And he, though, was very interested, and openly so, about mediums and channeling. And so most of his books dealt with the combination of Martian thinking and the paranormal. So he was very open about it, whereas Lowell became increasingly conservative about it, not really wanting to admit as much that he believed in the paranormal. Flammarion was very open about it. He used to have channelers. In fact, he said there was probably a medium in Paris that hadn't been to his house, that he had not spent time attempting to conjure spirits. Flammarion talked about how it was absolutely proven that levitation, they would levitate tables, you know, put their hands on the table and levitate tables. That, in fact, he has photographs in his books, even though these books were published in around 1905 or whatever. Some of them American published, in fact, in New England. He has pictures of levitating tables and table wrapping and so forth. So Flammarion, you know, investigated the paranormal even before the guy J.B. Ryan and Duke and all that. In fact, in London, William James had actually already started as the head of the spiritual paranormal research. Oh, that's my phone. Let me turn that off. I thought I killed my cell phone. I forgot to kill my landline cell phone. But anyway, Flammarion was talking about the paranormal. People would come from around Paris to talk to him about ghosts and spirits and so forth. But he spent his time at south of Paris at a chalet. Actually, it was really more like a mansion that was gifted to him by a follower. As I remark in my book, I hope that my book is so compelling that someone wishes to gift me with a mansion in France. That would be really nice. I'm very open to moving to Paris. It's okay. So, but it's probably not going to happen. But anyway, so Flammarion was so well thought of. He wrote over 50 books, and he kind of was the key guy that really connected the paranormal and Martian thinking. But the reality is, for the next 50, 60 years, there's a guy named Robert Crossley. He does a fabulous book studying just the literature associated with Mars. He studies H.P. Lovecraft. He talks about, obviously, Ray Bradbury, Edgar Rice Burroughs. He talks about C.S. Lewis. Consider C.S. Lewis's books some of the best literature actually done on the whole study of Mars. Wow. And but anyway, the Flammarion, all of his books on popular astronomy. He wrote a book called Popular Astronomy, but he also wrote books on the paranormal. And so Mars was, at the turn of the century, in 1900, it was understood. Everybody believed that there was intelligent life on Mars. It was so common that people used the Martian story as a means to prove Marxism, utopianism.
Oh, wow.
Parents even used the study of Mars to tell their children how they should dress, because all Martian boys and girls knew to part their hair on the right side. They knew to brush their teeth, and so we should all be more like the Martians.
Oh, wow.
And we'll save it for next time, but we might want to start off talking next time about Marconi and Tesla.
That's so funny. That's actually the next question in my list
Yeah,
was about Tesla and Marconi.
yeah, because both of them published articles in 1900, 1901 in popular magazines, periodicals like the Collier's Weekly, talking about their experiences using their new wireless invention,
Hmm.
the radio, to actually talk to entities, intelligence on Mars.
Wow.
So it was a common view, and so part of the context to bring out to the listener is that the notion of ancient aliens is a cyclical notion. It has been around for a long time.
Hmm.
It was popular, obviously, in this time period, about 120 years ago. It was popular again as the H.P. Lovecraft books, and we haven't really talked about Lovecraft. We should talk about Lovecraft more next time we get together.
Hmm.
But Lovecraft's books, written in the 20s and 30s, were very popular in the 40s and 50s. Once again, there was a great deal of interest in extraterrestrials in that time period. When Mariner 4 went by in the 60s and took 22 pictures of Mars in a flyby, it was the first time that we realized that there were craters on Mars, and there
Wow.
were lots of craters on Mars. And so it began to work sort of to the dismay of scientists
Hmm.
that gee, maybe Mars is a lot like our lifeless moons. Maybe there isn't life on Mars, and um, and so it became kind of a down period, if you will, for the notion of life on Mars until 1976 when the face on Mars was discovered, and 1983 when it began to be studied by Stanford Research Institute, Richard Hoagland. There were studies being done at that time. There had been earlier studies done in the late 70s and into the 1980s by Lambert Dolphin Jr., who's an evangelical, still alive today, with us today. But he was actually in charge of a project in Egypt studying whether or not Edgar Cayce was right, that there really was a hall of ancient records under the right paw of the Sphinx.
Hmm.
But in 1983, there was a lot of movement in the military at Stanford Research Institute. You already had remote viewers, probably remote viewing Mars, and they were trying to connect the dots between Egypt and Mars and Martian pyramids.
Hmm.
So this was a topic that was being studied. Was being funded in part by Florida State University, and became a very, very big issue. And so you also had, in the 1970s, you had Eric Van Daniken's book, Chariots of the Gods.
Hmm.
You had a lot of follow-up books by him. You had films being made. You had TV shows, the In Search of Alien Astronauts, hosted by Rod Serling of Twilight Zone fame. It was a big time as well. So it all kind of it come and go. But then Hoagland has continued to be emphatic with the discoveries. The book Dark Mission, written I think in 2006, talks a great deal about the notion of hyperdimensionality, which gets into Tesla's physics,
Hmm.
and the notion that the Martian monuments, Graham Hancock, we haven't talked about him yet. We have to talk about him. And the monuments on Mars, that they were actually trying to teach us an alternative physics, a physics that proves that Einstein's physics are not correct.
Wow.
And so all this stuff is supposedly embedded in Martian monuments, and we can talk about that next time as well. So anyway, the notion of Mars has been a popular notion. It's been very influential in Ancient Aliens, and I'm believing that it will be once again at some point, probably not with a jelly donut, but with probably some other rock. It will prove to be an artifact on Mars, and then we'll probably have this discussion in more earnest. If we're still here and we haven't been raptured.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, we've just barely scratched the surface of your book, and yeah, I think we mentioned at the top of the show, I'm a little past halfway through it right now, and I have nothing else planned this weekend, so I'm planning on finishing your book, and
Okay,
probably
we can do another show in a week or so. And
yeah.
and
Yeah, I was gonna ask if you have time next week. I pre-record all my shows, but I air them on Monday, so this will be airing this Monday. So if you're
towards
available,
the end of next week, we might be able to do another show,
all right.
after you're ready, as soon as you've read and you're ready to talk further, we can go into some more of these discussions.
Absolutely, I'm very excited about that. And yeah,
Good.
like I said, we've barely scratched the surface. But for people who would like to order your book or find out
Right.
more about you, where can
Yes.
they go?
They can certainly order the book today at Amazon.com. You can just do a search on either Lying Wonders of the Red Planet. There's a couple of Lying Wonders books, so you need to make sure it's Lying Wonders of the Red Planet. You can do a search on S. Douglas Woodward and find all my books. Also, I have a website called faithhappens.com. It's faith-happens.com. You can also just do a search on dougwoodward.com, and that will take you to my website. You'll see a few postings related to the book, as well as postings on other topics of interest that I've talked about. So I have several of my books are ebooks now. The Power Quest books, Decoding Doomsday, Are We Living in the Last Days? Those are ebooks and available on Kindle, on iBook, on Nook, and at Lulu. So there's several ways to find some of my books. The book Lying Wonders has only been out for about 5 days, 6 days, and it'll also be featured. I'm planning to do a couple of television shows. We'll record next week with Gary Stearman at Prophecy in the News, and those will be on TV in 3 or 4 weeks probably. So,
Right.
so more to come.
Yeah, absolutely. Fantastic. Well, I want to thank you so much for being on the show. And if everything goes to plan, then part 2 will air a week after this one airs. But
All right.
yeah, I really appreciate you taking the time to be on the show and share
You
some of
bet.
your enlightening us on this important topic.
Yeah, well, it's not an easy one, and it does cause you to sort of stretch your mind a bit. But at the end of the day, we still hold the Bible to be true.
Absolutely. I couldn't
It's
agree more.
worldview to be true. So, very good. All right. Well, Josh, thank you very much for the opportunity. I appreciate it.
Yeah, anytime, and thank you. Well, again, that was S. Douglas Woodward, and his new book is called Lying Wonders of the Red Planet, Exposing the Lie of Ancient Aliens. And we will be, if everything goes to plan, we will be talking more about that in part 2 of the interview, which will air a week from now, Monday, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So look forward to seeing you there. That's all the time we have for tonight, so thank you for listening, and as always, take care, and God bless.